Welcome to Borders Talk, dots, dashes, and the stories they tell. We are Zalfa Fagali
and Gillian Roberts, two border studies academics in England's East Midlands, from different countries with multiple passports. Hello and welcome to today's episode. We have two guests with us, Deborah Toner and Caleb Bailey.
Dr. Deborah Toner is a social and cultural historian of Mexico, the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. She specializes in the history of alcohol, food, and identity, particularly in terms of race, ethnicity, social class, gender, medicine, and nationalism. That's a lot of stuff. In 2010, she co-founded with Mark Halewood the Drinking Studies Network, an interdisciplinary organization connecting researchers of drink and drinking cultures across different societies and time periods. Deborah is both, and I know this from experience, Deborah is both an excellent cook and an excellent scholar, and a lot of her work is at this intersection. She's the author of the 2015 book, Alcohol and Nationhood in 19th Century Mexico, as well as the co-edited Stories on Our Plate, Recipes and Conversations, and that was from 2018. And in 2021, she published the edited collection, Alcohol in the Age of Industry, Empire and War. With a very shady co-editor, she is working on the Routledge Companion to Gender and Borderlands, which is coming out next year. One hopes. Deborah has led or been part of loads of really exciting projects, including her AHRC project Alcohol, Race and Ethnicity, the US, Mexico and the Wider World, 1845 to 1940, and the ESRC-funded project on which she was co-investigator called Mental, Neurological and Substance Use Disorders in Guyana's Jails, 1825 to the present. Deborah's fun fact is that by the end of 2023, she will have seen the band Princess Goes in concert a total of 13 times.
Yeah!
Hardcore. She is a hardcore listener. And so before we move on to talk about Caleb, Deborah, I wanted to ask you what got you into border studies. Why are you here?
Oh, God. Well, it's one of those things where I got into it through teaching. So there's 3 modules that I've been involved in, like co-designing and then co-teaching on global history, on the American West and America's plural, all of which to one extent or another are about encouraging students to think beyond the nation state. And it was through doing those modules that I kind of realized, okay, this is actually something that I've always been interested in because, you know, I started my kind of research career researching the history of Mexican nationalism and its relationship to questions to do with alcohol. So from the start, I've been thinking about like nationalism and nationhood as constructed entities, which brings us right back to border thinking.
Constructed entities. I think that's going to come up a lot today. I'm looking at Caleb.
Our second guest is Dr. Caleb Bailey, who is a teaching associate in the Department of American and Canadian Studies at the University of Nottingham, where he received his PhD in 2016 and where he teaches literature and cultural studies. He is an interdisciplinary scholar whose research focuses on borders and the development of hemispheric approaches to studies of North America. He's published work in the European Journal of American Studies, the Journal of Borderlands Studies, and the forthcoming Routledge Companion to Gender and Borderlands. Fun fact about Caleb, he is a big fan of Bruce Springsteen, but not of dynamic pricing.
I think that's fair enough to say, and we can probably put some editorializing in our show notes.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I
get
think
the message
Caleb
out
will be
there.
very happy to give us some reading material on both dynamic ticket pricing and Bruce Springsteen.
Please. Can I just say Princess Goes concert tickets are very affordable?
Noted. Okay.
Thanks for that advice to our listeners. Caleb, tell us what got you interested in border studies.
I'll try not to make this too convoluted, but I think it starts with the work I undertook on my master's. So there I was dealing with ideas around regionalism and particularly about how Alaska exists in the US kind of national and cultural imagination. So this is a territory that is known as the frontier state. And so I was looking at it in terms of how it articulates in today's times the frontier thesis and how it is somewhere where America goes to kind of revisit its past. What that led me to kind of realising is that the Alaska Purchase kind of hastens Canadian Confederation in some respects. So that got me interested in how those borders kind of came into being. And so when I started my PhD, and I was very much interested in Canadian culture, I got frustrated by lots of fellow PhD candidates and by staff within the department that they didn't have any interest in Canadian stuff. And so I was trying to use borders to kind of correct what's famously been called a rhetorical malpractice in terms of American studies not being truly American in the sense that it refuses to engage with Canadian or Mexican culture, history, texts, etc. And so that's where my interest in border studies kind of stems from.
I love, in inverted commas, those maps of the US where you've got like Alaska kind of floating independently of any body of land.
Oh, the ones that completely erase.
Yeah. And then there's like Hawaii, which is suspiciously close to the rest of the United States,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and it's just like, oh yeah, here's our like satellite sort of nation state. It's
Yeah,
all...
they fly in the face of kind of, that denial of colonialism on the US's part, especially those weather maps where they bring them kind of closer together, but also suggest that there isn't anything in between.
Yes. Unless, of course, there's bad weather coming from Canada, in which case, blame Canada, famously. So one of the things we're here to talk about today is the forthcoming volume of the Routledge Companion to Gender and Borderlands, which is being co-edited by Deborah and Zalfa. Please, will you tell us what got you interested in this project, this very large project?
Well, and you should say as well that both Gillian and Caleb are contributing to this book as well. So we are a big happy family here today for our Gender and Borderlands handbook. But
I'm just feigning ignorance.
Zalfa is really the one who brought the idea of co-editing this to me. So I think you should explain the origins of this book.
I did say I was shady. It started, as a lot of these things do, with an email, and I'm now sort of traumatized by emails in general, but this one was a nice one to get. It was from one of the editors at Routledge who asking me to peer review a proposal for another book in the Routledge Gender and something companion series. And she asked me if there was anything in the series that seemed that there was a gap that I thought I could fill. And I said, well, Borderlands, obviously. And I immediately thought of you, Deborah, in part because of some of the teaching that we were doing together on a module called The West as part of the American Studies program here at Leicester, sadly no longer running. But because we had been teaching on that and because, well, we get on quite well. And I thought, well, you should try and work with people you don't mind. And if we ended up
resounding endorsement.
Well, I mean, if we end up hating each other, that's okay. But we haven't yet, although of course the book hasn't come out, so there's still time.
No, I mean, I think this was, for context, this was back in, I think late 2018, actually. End
of 2018.
Yeah, when we started talking about it. And that was, I think it was the first year that we co-taught the West module.
That's right.
Because we redesigned it over the previous year, and we'd kind of redesigned it around, interestingly, actually, from what you were saying, Caleb, around the idea of the frontier as a central part of American mythology. Yeah. I've always been a little bit of a kind of weird addition to the American Studies team at Leicester because I work on Latin America and Mexico. So, but from the outset, that was welcomed. And so we'd been doing this teaching together, thinking all about like how that border was constructed, how it was built over time, how it's changed over time, and the different ways that scholarship has responded to that as well. And we're 5 years on from that point now? We're getting close to 5 years on from that point now, and we haven't fallen out yet, so it's fine.
I think we're okay. But I mean, in the same way that we used our different border studies interests to shape that module, we've done the same thing, I think, with this book, trying to think through different sets of borderlands and moving beyond the ones that we would sort of expect to talk about, which I think we'll come to when we chat a bit with Caleb about how he has come to contribute to the companion. But I've always been a comparative border studies scholar. I think I've always said that it's easier for me to think in those terms because there's just more material for me to deal with. And I really enjoy having more stuff to read rather than just being limited to one area. So it made sense. Of course, Deborah helpfully is a historian, and I shall we say not, a historian. So it was useful to have that spread as well.
So what is it like working across those disciplines together as a literature scholar and a historian? How does it affect, the editing of this book?
Well, it's been great because we have totally different ways of doing it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I think I always want more dates and things.
And I have no problem with no dates. And it's actually, I found myself introducing dates as much as I can now, which is that you've definitely influenced me usefully.
Because we're dealing with people who are contributing to the book are coming from a lot of different disciplines. So I think it's actually been really useful that we both come from different disciplinary backgrounds, because at least that's a start, that we're not coming to everybody's work when we're reviewing it from the same disciplinary approach. And so it means, I think there are parts of the reviewing process that we approach differently, so that I think it's fair to say, actually, in most cases, we've been broadly in agreement overall about how we sort of see what revisions we should be asking for. But we do also pick up on different things as well. So my date-based obsession is an example of that. But I think more broadly, it might be evident from the introduction that Zalfa gave to me that as a historian, I'm also quite promiscuous in terms of the range of things that I look at. And part of that does include disciplinary promiscuousness as well. So my PhD was actually based on a historical analysis of literature. The Drinking Studies Network that I've been involved in, we have scholars from all sorts of different social sciences and sciencey backgrounds, as well as the humanities. So that kind of interdisciplinary working is always something that I've been both comfortable with, but also just find so much more interesting and kind of rewarding than sticking to one lane. So this project has been fantastic. I've learned so much from different people's contributions.
Oh, our contributors are amazing. We can talk about some examples later maybe, but I do remember this reading through one chapter after you had your first pass at it, and your first comment was, there are archives in this one. And I heard that comment. I heard you say that comment in my head. And I remember thinking, she's really happy about this. I can't remember whose it was, but it must have been an early chapter. In almost every case, we have been entirely in agreement, maybe in approaching a restructure in slightly different ways or different suggestions. And Deborah, you are in some ways more interventionist than I am. And in other ways, the advice I give can sometimes be a little bit nebulous. So it's been really useful to think through how another person reads and how best to present feedback to a scholar who's often in a discipline that is different from both of ours.
Yeah. So in terms of this interdisciplinarity across the volume, how important was that to you in envisioning the volume and who you invited to contribute? Can you say more about the remit of the book in terms of geographical spread as well? What were your principles of selection?
So from the outset, the overarching, I think, most important decision was we want this to be global in scope. So we were both North Americanist scholars in different formulations of that. And of course, the US-Mexico border has a very special place in border studies scholarship. But from the outset, we wanted it to be truly global, and not just across the book as a whole, but to as much as it was possible for each section of the book that looks at a different sort of thematic aspect or kind of conceptual approach, I suppose. We wanted each of those to deal with at least 5 or 6 different sort of geographical areas of the world. So that was kind of principle number 1. Principle number 2, I think, was that we wanted to make sure that the contributors, so the authors who were contributing to the book, were similarly diverse in terms of where they're based geographically, the disciplines that they work within, different career stages as well, and different kind of conceptual approaches. I think in terms of, we want someone to work on literature here or history there, I think that was a little bit further down the list in terms of priorities, but we wanted it to be very multidisciplinary and focused from the outset as well. And I think after we'd kind of mapped out the kind of geographical and contributor kind of range in each section, we then had to think about what disciplinary approach is missing and kind of made further then selections on that basis.
I think it was a really interesting process of curation, I guess, because we were trying to make sure that we were being as inclusive as possible when talking about these places and kind of experiences that were always at risk of being exclusive and contained in different ways. So we were trying to both contain them and open them up. But I mean, it is a great, even if I do say so myself, it is a great spread of people, and the feedback that we've had from everyone who's contributed and everyone who kind of has had a look at the table of contents has been very positive so far.
So what are the sections that the volume is divided into?
So we have an introductory section, as books often do, with an overall kind of introduction to the volume. I think we are going to spend quite a bit of time explaining that process of selection and those decisions in that introduction, and particularly in terms of the global dimensions. And then 2 separate essays introducing different approaches, conceptual approaches to gender studies and border studies. So Caleb will tell us all about that later. And then we have sections that kind of, thematic is sort of the wrong word, they kind of proceed in different levels. So we start at the level of kind of individual and family with a section called Intimate Borders, and then broaden out in a variety of different ways into a section on cultural and civic borders, kind of looking at different cultural expressions of borders or their defiance, and then kind of state institutions and processes that also kind of police borders. Then the next 2 sections are kind of about the structural violence of borders, both in an embodied sense. So there's the 3rd section is called Embodied and Violent Borders. The next section after that is then economic borders, so looking at the structural aspects of economic violence. And then there's a final section on, we've called it changing, challenging, resisting. That's the one. That's about different, obviously, ways that borders can be resisted and challenged. And I think those essays are mainly based on the different cultural ways that can happen as well. So that's the general organisation of the book.
You've really stressed rightly the global scope of this project. Are there particular additional gaps in existing literature that the book fills, or conversations that it furthers?
I mean, this is a very specific answer to a broader question, but there is a lot of material here on women, and a lot of the time gender and women are conflated in a way that we don't necessarily agree with and shouldn't. What I like is that there are a few essays in which that boundary is really productively and generatively blurred and erased.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of essays that focus on women, and I think probably an unsurprising finding of the book when you kind of look at these issues comparatively is that in many cases and in many ways, the structural violence on borders falls disproportionately on women for a variety of different
And there's nothing wrong with focusing on that, absolutely.
But we have also tried to incorporate, there are essays that are specifically on masculinity and men's issues in that sense. There are essays that concentrate on the LGBTQ plus communities in different parts of the world. And there are some essays that are kind of ostensibly focused on women's experience, but the way they've approached that is in a very inclusive way, including considerations of trans issues and things like that, for instance. But I think it is fair to say that there probably could have been more essays that explored trans issues and LGBTQ issues more broadly.
Am I hearing volume 2?
I think one of the things we haven't talked about yet, and this is by no means justification or defense, but the version of the collection that we started out with is not the collection that we've ended up with. And, this is perfect as it is, for what it is. But as Deborah said, we started in sort of late 2018, 2019, we sent this off to the publisher as a proposal. And then in 2020, like this thing happened that across borders that disproportionately affected women and other gender minorities.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
No, nobody does. It's just one of my
very
kind
obscure.
of, one of my niche interests. And that has disproportionately, again, for its part, affected the way that this book has played out. And what we have tried to do over the last few years has been to be as, well, not just as flexible as we could, but as flexible as we needed to be for ourselves as editors and as scholars who want to inhabit a position of not necessarily slow scholarship, but ethical engagement with the work that we're, asking people to do. And that meant that lots of things shifted, lots of experiences that we were hoping could be foregrounded or made present in the book may not be there in the same way that we wanted. So whether it's volume 2 or whether it opens the conversation up for other people to fill the gap, a lot of the amazing early career researchers who we do showcase in the collection may want to take this forward. And those are conversations that we want to have.
Right, exactly. And I just have to mention the gap of the gab.
The gap of the gab.
Which this brought me great amusement in the process of, acronyms are wonderful things. But yeah, probably about 18 months ago, I suppose, when, we had reached a stage that, okay, we need to start bringing this to completion. Some people have submitted their essays a long time ago, but some people have very understandably, because of all of those mysterious things that we forget what happened in 2020, had to withdraw and, different priorities changed. So we went through this process that became known as the gap of the gab. So gap assessment process of the Gender and Borderlands book. So we kind of figured out, okay, so because that chapter is no longer going to be part of it, which geographical area is missing from this section now, or which kind of thematic approach is missing from this section, which disciplinary approach is missing. And so in the process of commissioning new chapters to fill those gaps, the gap of the gab was designed basically to make sure that we were retaining the integrity of the global ambitions of the book as the kind of principle number one, basically. And I think by and large, we've managed to achieve that. So there might be a little bit of there might be one section that is a little bit maybe North American heavy, just because so much scholarship on borders happens in the North American context.
But it's also not the sort of North American heavy that you would expect.
No, exactly.
There are some incredibly exciting essays on non-creatural relations and...
Or shall I read out the title of the one that I think you're referring to?
Go for it.
This is going to be a great test.
Border Women, Queer Mestizas and Nagualas. Gloria Ansaldo's Borderlands Ontologies. Is that the one you were thinking of?
That's certainly one of them. And I was also thinking about
That's by Suzanne Boast, by the way.
And it's a great essay. I'm thinking about the one in the final section.
Oh, Relational Ecologies in Contemporary Chicana Border Art by
Stephanie Luthwaite.
Yes, well done.
Who's she? Just kidding. She's my colleague.
Yes, and a future guest.
Promise of a future guest.
The promise of a future guest is always already there.
To quickly come back to your question that started off this diversion in the gap of the gap, in terms of sort of bringing together or filling gaps in existing literature, I think with that global dimension of the book, we are putting together comparatively scholarships that don't really speak to one another. For example, there are two essays that explore the impact of borders on access to reproductive health care and abortion in particular. One of those is written about the US-Mexico borderlands or the Texas borderlands. One is on the borders of Ireland, so both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And both of those essays have been grappling with the fact that the situation in those different locations has changed dramatically, actually during the course of producing this book. But I think it would be very rare for scholars working on abortion in Northern Ireland to be speaking to scholars who are working on similar issues in Texas.
But that's an amazing thing about this volume, is to demonstrate that, that there's some overlap in those different vocations. I did want to ask you a final question. I mean, you've given some really exciting and enticing examples of new and innovative approaches to the Mexico-US border. But I wondered about borderlands that are addressed in this book that we associate less commonly with dominant border studies scholarship. If you have examples of borderlands that you were really excited to be able to include here.
I've paired these two essays, even though I don't even think they're currently in the same section. We have two essays on shuttle trade, one in Eastern Europe and the other in Africa, and different ways in which women are using shuttle trade to subvert colonial and post-colonial borders. And it's that sort of comparative approach that as editors, we get to read this before everyone else does. And we've sort of been building these relationships between these chapters in our minds for months and years. But what's going to be really satisfying is bringing them all together, both in our introduction, but in the way that we can pair them and talk about them. We're going to be developing, hopefully, some educational materials, linking them up. So thinking through different modes of resistance. It isn't a volume that focuses on how terrible borders are for gender or how amazing gender is for borders. It's one that sort of acknowledges that both borders and gender are differently embodied and differently culturally signified in different contexts. And I think it's really exciting. And it's one that's, for me, quite joyful.
Yes, the two that I kind of conceptually pair together, and they are in different sections of the book, are Runak's essay on the female family members of political prisoners in Kashmir, on the kind of India-Pakistan borderlands. And then the essay that's on colonial carceral borderlands in Australia, Bermuda, and Gibraltar. So looking at how the British Empire basically used incarcerated people's labour in penal colonies in different locations.
And islands.
Exactly. And so those two essays kind of explore the impact of different practices of incarceration in really conceptually interesting ways, in obviously very different locations and in different time periods as well, because the one based in Kashmir is based on the present day, that's based on ethnographic field research. The one on colonial carceral borderlands is obviously historical, focusing on the kind of mid to late 19th century. So it's in those kinds of conversations between chapters, I think, that the book is most exciting. But also, I think in terms of specific geographies, weirdly, I think, because of the concentration on the US-Mexico border, you don't see a lot of South America, Latin America, borderland scholarship.
Which we have a decent amount of representation.
And we have a couple of essays that are exploring different aspects of the Chilean, Peruvian and Bolivian borderlands. So that for me is really exciting because as a Latin Americanist, Latin America so often gets left out of the conversation. And I'm really pleased that that hasn't happened here.
I'm so excited for this book to come out. Late 2024. Is that right?
We think so. I mean, we're on track for getting it to the publisher in a few months' time, let's say. So that will be, it depends when this is broadcast. So that's not helpful.
Maybe it's come out already.
You're going out live, don't you?
in the last quarter of 2023, and a book of this size has a long production time. So we're looking at it being published in the second half of 2024.
Fantastic. One of the pieces in the introductory section of this collection is Caleb's introduction to border studies, which I've had the great privilege to have a sneak preview of. So I have a few questions for Caleb, and full disclosure, I was one of Caleb's PhD supervisors, so I'm hoping this doesn't feel too much like a supervision for him.
I'm sure it does.
It's a little nerve-wracking, to be honest.
We're all friends here.
We've got your back, Caleb. We've got your back.
One big happy Borderlands family.
We haven't done the other full disclosure, which was that I was Zalfa's PhD examiner.
That's true.
Yeah,
for
but
your sins.
but I hope you've recovered from that. experience.
Yeah, I mean, we're apparently doing a podcast together.
Right.
So, I mean,
So we've overcome. We've overcome. Actually, famously, a former colleague said that Zalfa's viva was very uncharacteristic of vivas because there was lots of laughter coming out of my office during.
I do remember that. And that particular colleague met me outside during the viva break and said, "You're all laughing. This is a really good sign."
It was a really good sign. So, the viva was good. It was all good. Anyway, let's talk about Caleb's excellent piece. So I loved reading this introduction to border studies, kind of along the themes of the book as a whole. Just the scope of it was really wonderful, but it also felt really fluid at the same time, and it didn't feel like borders that shouldn't be discussed together were being discussed together. Lots of care and attention has gone into this remarkable piece. So I just wanted to pick up on a few things that spiked my interest. We've sort of alluded to this already, the place that Mexico-US border, the place that border has in border studies scholarship. And we often see it referred to as the birthplace of the field. I've even quoted things to that event. But you begin with the Berlin Wall, actually. I mean, you then mentioned the Mexico-US border. But I wonder, Caleb, if this was a conscious choice to start not with the Mexico-US border. And if in looking to the Berlin Wall, this was an active, attempt to expand the lens of the field and how we tend to talk about it in more dominant terms.
I mean, it was a deliberate choice, yeah. In an earlier draft of the introduction, I did begin by talking about that event in 2020 that we're not mentioning.
The event that does not speak its name.
We want to forget. No one wants to forget it more than the government, it would appear. So my first draft was about all these fiat borders which suddenly started appearing in our lives, and then when I came to redraft it, I thought, well, I can't do that. It's going to,
because the
date.
government will come.
It will date. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And so I thought, where do I start? And I thought, well, let's start with the Berlin Wall, and this is where my favourite editorial comment came from, because I'd said, as recently as the 1990s, and Deborah kindly pointed out that I'm not sure we can think about the 1990s as recent anymore.
I beg to differ.
I mean, trust me, I've only just come to terms with that fact myself.
This is the danger of being obsessed with dates.
Yeah, I know. But I have now come to terms with the fact that the 1990s weren't a few years ago. But
we're now waylaying Caleb's conversation. Sorry, Caleb.
That's all right. So, as you've said a few times already, the US-Mexico border just stands so, large in people's understanding of border studies. And I thought it was important to begin with a European border, I suppose, and to make the point that, yes, the US-Mexico border is important, but each border is unique, and you cannot take theory that derives from the US-Mexico border and transplant it wholesale into other contexts. We have to make particular adaptations. So focusing on a border in Europe seemed like, a good place to start. And people might dispute this kind of listing, but, there's some suggestion, and I refer to it in the introduction, that there were three borders that really kind of occupy the popular global consciousness following the Second World War, and that would be the border between North and South Vietnam, the kind of unofficial border between the north and south of the US in terms of segregation and unofficial segregation, and then the Iron Curtain. And so I figured, well, North and South Vietnam, that has been, is anything ever truly resolved when it comes to borders? But that's resolved.
Discuss.
Similarly, is the race issue in the US done with? No, but in terms of legislation, it has been resolved, in inverted commas. So the Berlin Wall is the final one of those to kind of play out, to, if not resolve itself, then, I think that the collapse of the Berlin Wall leads us into a new kind of phase of thinking about borders.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Now, to stay with Europe for a minute, you write in your piece about the almost complete complicity of European nations in the construction of the bordered world we inhabit today, which I think is such a crucial point, such an important point. And later on, you mentioned the notion of a borderless world that was touted by political leaders around the ratification of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, as an example. And this made me wonder about the EU and the Schengen area, partly because I've heard some people try to argue that, in previous years that NAFTA should be more like the EU and everyone should use a single currency, et cetera, et cetera. But I wondered how the EU might relate to your point about European countries being responsible for most of the world's borders today.
Okay. I mean, I think the Schengen area and NAFTA have a lot in common. There might be calls for NAFTA to be a bit more like the EU, but I think actually NAFTA and what we see in the Schengen area in terms of, no border controls, no passports, etc., amongst member states, has a very similar kind of impulse to NAFTA. Those borders kind of dissolve for economic reasons. It gets sold to us possibly as something to do with friendship and cultural commonality. But actually, the bottom line is that these borders disappear. I mean, obviously, they reappear at certain points as well, but they disappear purely for economic reasons. So it's presented to us as a kind of liberalisation of our daily lives in Europe. But actually, it's a neoliberalisation of the market that is driving this. And so whilst those borders disappear for intra-EU economic migration, at the same time, it means that the external borders are much more heavily policed. And so it is Europe, again, being kind of arrogant and dictating to the rest of the world, we'll remove our borders, but the borders, which invariably we probably drew in your countries, in Africa and in the Middle East, they're going to have to remain, I'm afraid, just as difficult for people to cross. So I think that reveals the kind of hypocrisy and contradiction that you can see, in terms of Europe's drawing of colonial boundaries in the past, but also how it kind of reinforces those boundaries in the present.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this element of colonialism and Europe. I mean, we often refer in border studies scholarship to nation-state borders in North America as colonial borders, but of course, they are also settler colonial borders. So I wondered how you see settler colonialism and borders operating in relation to each other in a way that might be different from colonialism and borders.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a fundamental difference. So with colonialism, what you're doing essentially is extending a nation's borders, extending its boundaries. So, with the North American colonies, this is now British territory. So you're just, kind of extending the border of the imperial centre. What happens then when colonialism is replaced by settler colonialism is that one single border suddenly becomes multiple. There are borders kind of emerging everywhere. So as the US or as Canada takes on more and more territory and extends its own borders, it comes into contact with more and more impediments, in inverted commas, in terms of encounters with indigenous people. And the first impulse is to kind of eradicate them because they're standing in the way of the creation of a holistic kind of homogenous state. And then eventually, when that doesn't happen, you very generously invite them into the body politic. Yeah.
Such a gift.
Yes. Yeah. So generous. But that involves a whole series of other bordering practices. So we have reserves and reservations. So we have internal borders that start to build up. And then land is kind of parcelled off and allotted and becomes private property. And inevitably, once you have the idea of private property amongst indigenous groups, then that private property, gets whittled down further. And so more and more borders stack up there. And then I think the most insidious kind of border that emerges in settler colonial situations would be the way in which the very act of being indigenous or being able to proclaim being an indigenous person is also bordered and boundaried and patrolled by the state. So I think that's the key difference really between colonialism and settler colonialism. I think colonialism, it treats indigenous people as a resource.
Yeah.
And then settler colonialism treats them as an impediment. And in order to get rid of that impediment, you need more and more borders to kind of control the narrative of the nation.
Expansion and then containment.
Yeah, exactly that.
I don't think I've ever heard a better response to that question when having to generate it on the fly. So well done.
Yes, well done.
We're all nodding vigorously
we all
through.
have repetitive strategies from having
It's the
nodded so
invisible
much.
nod. Yeah.
Can I jump in and ask a question about maps and thinking about, so one of the, I'm going to spoil the first sentence for our readers of your chapter, which is, the first sentence reads, despite their apparent cartographic fixity, borders are rarely, if at all, inert in their forms or functions. And you've just sort of enumerated one or two of their forms and functions. What role do you think cartographic practices and maps, which are now sort of being called into question, right? We try not to think about maps as actual representations of reality, but maybe they are more usefully described as routes or itineraries or becomings. And I know you sort of draw on this a little bit in the chapter, so I wondered if you could just expand on it a little.
Well, I think maps are tools, aren't they? Not only for kind of navigating,
Sure.
but tools for assimilating and controlling and laying claim to particular territories. And so, therefore, there is no one complete map of the globe. We can look at that political map, and that shows us where the borders are, but those borders are subject to change, either at a kind of international or national level or at an individual level. So I think that maps are always provisional. They're always processive. They're always in the process of being made and in the process of becoming. And so in work that I've done in the past, a lot of it is focused on how maps are palimpsests in terms of, you can overlay alternative territories on top of these, supposedly fully realised nation states. So, you can look at a map of North America and see Mexico, the US and Canada, or you can look at a map of North America and see Aztlan and Turtle Island and other imagined regions like Cascadia and those kind of places. So I think maps, they're part of the trick. Yeah. They're part of how you sell the idea of sovereignty and the nation state. So they're tied up in that deception, I think.
And I guess this leads to the language of striation, which you mentioned a few times in your essay. And this echoes, of course, the work of Deleuze and Guattari, which you don't really explicitly reference in this piece, but you have written about elsewhere. I just wondered if you could say more about what their work brings to your thinking about borders.
I think what Deleuze and Guattari do is show us how borders can be put into motion and made to do work that perhaps they're not designed to do, if that makes sense.
I think so, but say more.
Okay. So, actually, so Saldivar, in one of the kind of foundational texts of border studies, uses one of their concepts, and he refers to the border as a desiring machine. So, in that sense, I'm not breaking new ground by invoking Deleuze, but I think if we are to understand what the border does, we need to set it in motion. We need it to articulate. And I think a lot of the ideas that Deleuze and Guattari put forward kind of help in doing that. So, they have the idea of smooth and striated spaces. So the striations are the borders that are constructed for us, whereas the smooth space in between those borders is where interesting things can happen, where experimentation can take place. And they talk about how we can envisage smooth and striated spaces in terms of two different games. So chess, which they call a game of state, and then Go, which they call, I forget what they call it, a game of, but what that reveals to us is the way in which things like borders are hierarchical. and they expect us to move and behave in particular ways, whereas what their work is about is finding different ways to kind of circumvent those rules and those regulations. So I think some of those ideas are quite useful to thinking about borders and how we can reconfigure them, whilst at the same time, I must say, not kind of valorising the potential of the decentered subject. So a lot of kind of Euro-American philosophy of Deleuze's type gets criticised for kind of celebrating decentered subjectivity.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, obviously one of the main concerns of border studies is to not celebrate that, but to actually highlight it and point at it and show that that kind of exists, rather than using it as something to celebrate.
And we're using it in more of a metaphorical
capacity
of resistance. That does bring me to another question, which is about metaphor, because you talk about borders and metaphor in this piece. And I wonder if you find some border metaphors more useful or more fitting than others.
I think they're all useful in different ways. But again, just going back to my previous answer, to make sure that they're not celebrating that kind of postmodern, decentered subject, which, you know, always have to be kind of mindful about. I think my favourite metaphor would be threshold, because it implies an inside and an outside. It implies something that can be straddled, but it also gives people a sense that, you know, a threshold is something that you encounter on a daily basis. So it brings the border and the things that a border can do to you as a subject much more into everyday life. So I think that's really important, and particularly when we're considering, as this volume does, gender and Borderlands. So I think those metaphors are useful, and Deleuze and Guattari give us a lot of them, but I think also maybe a better one to kind of look at when it comes to gender would be to look at Certeau and his notion of strategies and tactics, and the way in which strategies are those things imposed on us in a top-down kind of approach, whereas the tactics are those things that we can do to kind of fight against those impositions.
Everyday things we can do. Exactly that. So I think the metaphors that are most useful are those ones that bring home and ground the experience of the border in our everyday kind of lived experience.
Amazing. Thank you.
The strategies and tactics distinction that you just mentioned, that is explicitly drawn on in, I think, at least one of the chapters on shuttle trade. I can't remember which one at the moment.
Absolutely.
But it's about that actually. So there are all of these reasons why the border kind of creates economic difficulties for different categories of people, but in building around that, then many people are also able to make opportunities out of that process.
And negotiate, exactly. And negotiate those sort of imposed systems. And I think across the book, which is why having an introductory chapter like this is such a thrill, really. Across the book, we see almost every single image and metaphor that you present being drawn out in all of the chapters. And as a result of this chapter, you do a lot of work to tie the other chapters together. And it wasn't deliberate, but it is incredibly effective.
That's quite fortuitous.
So
Caleb has not read the other chapters.
Yeah, it is. It's worth saying that you've written a great piece of work.
As if by magic. It's it's perfect.
For which we are incredibly grateful and excited to share with the rest of the world.
We would like to hear about borders that you have known. Deborah, what border have you known?
Okay, so the borders that I know best are based on growing up in Northern Ireland. So on one level, you have the kind of territorial borders between like Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which we did travel across many times as a family because my mum was from the Republic of Ireland and my dad was from Northern Ireland. But then there's also the more, I guess, on one level, psychological borders within Northern Ireland between Catholic/Republican/nationalist communities on the one hand and Protestant/loyalist/unionist communities on the other hand, that also kind of manifest in spatial ways, sometimes at a very, very micro level. And I've actually been back to Northern Ireland and Belfast in particular quite a few times over the last month or so. I've been thinking about it quite a lot. And one kind of memory or experience of this that really jumps out at me is remembering the absolute visceral shock I remember when I discovered how close together the Falls Road and the Shankill Road get at particular. I think I spent a lot of time in Belfast growing up because my grandparents lived there, but didn't spend a lot of time in the city. And it was only as a student really kind of going out and about in the town. And I was like, but they almost meet. And the way they've been talked about as these entirely, they could almost be part of two different worlds. And at one point you can walk between the Shankill Road and the Falls Road in 3 minutes. I think they could be this close. This is crazy. But yeah, those kinds of borders, the borders of Northern Ireland, basically, are the ones that I know best.
It's an amazing example of what borders do, what they are capable of doing is creating these two other worlds that are adjacent to each other in really palpable ways. Yeah. Caleb.
So I've twisted the question. So this is a border that I've abstractly known, but is important to me in terms of what it has led me to know. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Green Line in Cyprus that divides the island. So
I've not heard of that one. Just kidding.
Not even once. Big black line on a map, Gillian. Big black line.
The Sharpie.
The Sharpie line.
So yeah, I mean, growing up, I had quite a few family holidays in Cyprus, spent my honeymoon there, and it never occurred to me that this was a territory that was divided at any point, and divided quite so recently. And of course, who divided it? It was the British. And we go back to the idea of maps. One night a British general just drew a green line. That's why it's called a green line, because he had a green pencil across the island, and that was it. It was partitioned. So this is a border that isn't a border. It's a ceasefire line. But we kind of treat it like a border. So on the northern side of this line is the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. But only Turkey recognises it as a sovereign nation. But the UN kind of recognises it because they patrol the Green Line. So we've got this really weird contradictory space that exists. And so I never came into contact with that line, but certainly as we were driving from Larnaca to Paphos, we would pass Akrotiri, we'd pass Deucalion, which are these sovereign British territories. And so it just kind of brings home again the way in which Europe, and Britain in particular in this instance, are still kind of engaged in colonial practices, still engaged in processes of border making and bordering. And what I was talking earlier about how colonialism is about the extension of a border, it just really strikes me that, Akrotiri is the closest Britain's border gets to the Middle East.
It's an enclave.
Yes, yeah, and it completely complicates Cyprus's entry into the Schengen agreement. They've wanted to get involved in that agreement, but we're kind of stopping it in a way because of our claim to sovereignty over these two areas of the island. And kind of preparing to say all this, it led me to come across some interesting stuff that chimes with some of the other work I'm doing in terms of looking at how the Occupy movement has been theorised, and how that theorising doesn't extend to Indigenous people and their kind of protest movements. But there was an Occupy the Green Line movement in Cyprus that I wasn't aware of at all. So they occupied that no man's land. And of course, once you're in that land between the two nations, you're not a Greek Cypriot or a Turkish Cypriot, you are a Cypriot. So it means that border lines and borderlands can sometimes be kind of zones of exception where we can take on a different identity than the one that is supposedly, ours based on the borders which usually surround us.
Kind of suggests that this line of division is also then becoming a space of at least conceptual unity, right? This is the place where everyone then is just Cypriot, but it only exists in this conceptual
Exactly.
way,
In this kind of hinterland that, the British created, but no one seems to officially recognise.
While at the same time existing as a historical artifact that separates people from going back to where they're from.
Exactly.
On both sides,
Yeah.
right? And that's really interesting. And I wanted to pick up on something you said, because not only is Cyprus experiencing difficulties joining Schengen as a result of the British bases, but also the division of the island, and it's not worth necessarily going into the longer history of that, is the reason that the borders of the European Union are not expanding. So Turkey can't join for the same reason. So it's always used as an excuse to exclude, even when, the border with one hand gives and the other hand takes away.
Yeah.
So it's a really good example, one that's I'm personally invested in. But
yes, yeah.
A really good example.
And, it just kind of... There's so many interesting histories. The way in which Limassol, which is now a Greek Cypriot centre, was a Turkish Cypriot centre. And obviously, we have to think they're of a kind of diaspora on an island the size of Cyprus.
I mean, what's really interesting is that there are Turkish enclaves in Cyprus, and there are, in theory, Greek enclaves in the north. And it's sort of frozen in time, that conception of the island, where actually the world keeps moving and borders, they're trying to be expanded. And yet there are different sets of accountability that aren't being spotlighted, I guess.
Exactly that, yeah.
Thanks so much to Deborah and to Caleb for being our guests and for sharing your border stories with us.
What borders have you known? Tell us your stories.
Until next time, we've been Zalpha and Gillian on the line. Thanks for listening.